What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. What position should you draft early? A few people have asked me to make a video like this, and so I tried to put one together that would answer all of the different questions. And the goal of this video is to look at the impact of your roster when you select different positions in the early rounds of drafts. The impact to your team if you draft a top-end tight end, or a stud running back, or a stud wide receiver. Ultimately, I want to say this before we even start, there are issues that we're going to look at with doing something like this. But I did have some interesting findings that I know is going to help you in drafts. So if you don't mind, how about leaving a like on the video? It helps us know you guys are enjoying the content. But we got to start things off like always with the stat of the day. Today's stat: among running backs with at least 100 snaps where they ran a pass route, who saw the highest percent of those snaps come from the slot? Alright, let's begin this breakdown. And when I began making this video, my goal was to show you how teams could be different depending on the position you draft early on, and to take a look at expected point differences between the two teams, depending if you took maybe a tight end early, and then how could the expected points differ for if you waited on tight end later in drafts. But there are a lot of problems in doing that. The rest of your team is greatly impacted by how other people draft, and realistically, you could finish your draft in a bunch of different ways that are going to impact your expected points. I'll give you an example. Let's say you start off the draft with Melvin Gordon and Travis Kelce. This is just an example. It has nothing to do with actually those two players. I mean, I guess Kelce would be an early tight end, but it has nothing to do with Melvin Gordon. You don't want Melvin Gordon. Say running back X. You drafted running back X late in the first round, and then Travis Kelce in the early second round. There's no real way to determine the impact to your team in expected points, because you could handle the rest of running back plus quarterback and wide receiver in so many different ways. All of the quarterbacks will still be on the board, so you could attack that in any way possible. You could go wide receiver heavy over the next few rounds. You could take one wide receiver and then take some running backs. You could skip out entirely on wide receivers till the back half of the draft. And every one of those decisions will come down to who's left on the board, how big's your league size, what are the scoring settings. Everything is different. There are just too many possible outcomes that there is not one set strategy. So I want to say that to be entirely clear. No matter what your scoring format, there is not one strategy that is just going to work, where you can just walk into the draft and be like, I'm doing this. That doesn't exist. Everything's going to depend on how your draft plays out. But what isn't going to change is scarcity in how that relates to value. Below is a graph of my personal projections for each position, excluding quarterback for a few reasons, but mainly so that you can actually see what's going on. When you add that fourth position in there, it just gets way too hectic. So only looking at the top 50 for each position, and I think this does an excellent job at showing why I draft the way that I do. The blue area on the graph is running backs, the orange is wide receiver, and the green is tight end. And there are a few key takeaways from this. The first is the distinction between running back and wide receiver. All of the running backs outproduce their respective wide receiver in expected points until you make it to running back 20. Then the reverse is true. So it would be a very smart strategy to target each position when they're more valuable. Target the running backs when they're expected to score more points. Then target the wide receivers when they're expected to score more points. I think we all know that this is true deep down when we're drafting, but then we see the wide receiver value early on, and we look at it and we take it because it's value, right? How can you not take it? Well, there are a boatload of wide receivers that you can start in fantasy. I mean, look at the graphic. There are guys going in the 40s and 50s that are on pace with top 20 running backs. Here's another way of looking at it. What I did in this graphic is I compared the expected points of each position with the first bench player. So for tight end, it's comparing to tight end 13. I'm assuming a 12-team league for this. So comparing it to tight end 13. For running back and wide receiver, we're comparing to the wide receiver and running back 31. That would assume you can start two, so two running back, two wide receiver, and that your league has a flex spot, and then half of the people start a running back in the flex, half start a wide receiver. So if we're looking at the wide receiver 5, Compare that to the first bench player. Well, how many points is the wide receiver 5 expected to score over the wide receiver 31? That's exactly what this is showing. It's giving you the value over replacement level. Wide receivers give you less of an edge when you start the respective wide receiver over a bench wide receiver. And you're at less of a disadvantage when you start a bench wide receiver instead of a start-worthy wide receiver. Because think about it. If there are a ton of these wide receivers, why not just be like, hey, I'm just going to start Marquez Valdes-Scantling as my wide receiver 2, because his expected value really isn't that much lower than, say, a mid-round wide receiver. Both of these graphics show that it's smart to target the running back in the beginning of drafts and then take late wide receiver, since their value doesn't really diminish all that much in the later rounds. I mean, just look at the slope of the projections in the first image. Take a look at how the wide receiver production drops off behind the top guys. I mean, the difference between running back 10 and running back 30 is 92 fantasy points. But the difference between wide receiver 10 and wide receiver 30 is only 54 points. What that means is that there's a larger drop-off in production with every running back taken off the board. Now, some drop-offs are larger than others, and I believe that our tiered rankings do a great job of showing you that. But in general, if you're going to wait around on a position, then waiting on wide receiver is more beneficial to your team, because the opportunity cost at running back and tight end is much greater. I mean, think back to economics. Opportunity cost is what you lose out on by going with the next best alternative. There's an opportunity cost with every single one of your picks in the draft. So since running backs carry the highest opportunity cost, you should be taking them while you still can. Now, this doesn't mean that you should be drafting players you don't like just because I'm telling you to take running back, because your entire team should be filled with players you do want. But I'd be very surprised if you had a pick in the first 4 rounds where there wasn't a single running back or tight end that you didn't want, because that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. Well, what about the tight end position? Because I love drafting Travis Kelce in that second round. Now, the funny thing was, I was making this video when the Tyreek Hill news broke. Before that, this graph showed that there was a very real case to drafting Travis Kelce in the late first round. His projection was so much higher than that next tier of tight end, so his value was on par with running back 6 to 8 range. Now, it's a little bit lower. If you look at this, he's now worth where he's going, a mid-second round pick, because he's more on par with that running back 10 to 12 range. And since things like this happen, where I have one projection and one ranking, but then news comes out that entirely changes things, I highly suggest you get our draft package at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. It's always being updated for the latest news and updates, because I can't change these videos. Once the news breaks, the video is already up. I can't go back and change things. So if you want to stay up to date on news as it changes and how it directly relates to fantasy, then head to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com, and get the draft package. But as it stands right now, Travis Kelce's worth a mid-second round pick, because that's what the value is that he provides. But what about Ertz, Kittle, and the rest of the gang? Well, the difference between Ertz, Kittle, Henry, Howard isn't that big. There is not a big drop-off, and I believe in my rankings I'm going to make it Kelce in Tier 1 and those 4 in Tier 2. But that's not how it's being drafted. In drafts, it's costing you significantly more capital to get Ertz and Kittle, and because of that reason, I'm not drafting them, because the value that they provide you over replacement just isn't worth where they're being drafted. But it does show that Hunter Henry and OJ Howard are being undervalued this season. Those two, if you can see the green on the screen, are included in that second tier before that big drop-off. They carry the same value to your team as a top 12 to 15 running back, but they're being taken rounds later than that. So what does all of this mean? If I was to wrap this up in a nice little paragraph of what does this mean when I walk into a draft under normal settings. This isn't a 6-point passing, this isn't a super flex league, this isn't 7 points for every first down. This is in your normal PPR, half-point PPR, the typical bench, no crazy bonuses. In a normal league, I would be targeting Travis Kelce in the mid-second round Then if you miss out on him, go after Hunter Henry and OJ Howard in the 4th and 5th rounds. That's where the value lies at the tight end position. For running backs, I would target them early and often. If you miss out on Kelce, you want running backs. If you get Kelce, load up on running backs in the next few rounds. Wide receivers, while they might look like great steals at times early in drafts, they just don't provide you with enough value over replacement level to warrant selection over the top end running backs and tight ends. Just think about all the wide receivers we love that are available in the mid to late rounds. Kirk, Pettis, Shepard, Fitz, Samuel, Cutie, MVS, Sutton, Miller, Moncrief, Hamilton, Brown, Quinn. There is an incredible amount of wide receiver and quarterback talent in the back half of drafts that it just makes too much sense to lock up your running backs and tight ends early on. I know I didn't go over the quarterback position in this video, but it's because I've mentioned it a million times that value in drafting quarterback is in the later rounds. If you want to see a breakdown on that position like I did here, then let me know. But it's essentially the same as wide receiver, but more extreme. You can get someone in the 12th to 14th round that's going to give you more than enough fantasy points. So it's not worth missing out on these early to mid-round skill position players to draft someone that offers nearly identical expected points in the later rounds of drafts. So remember, you can download my personal projections, my rankings, and player notes at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this video. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new here, how about subscribing to the channel? But thanks for watching.